I like my soccer team, something that starts to hurt the and there's a scout team. We're not getting so Augustine's argument for the gap, but we basically our numbers reveal like what like the number one is it a physical thing? But basically this one guy is like
Am I good to go? How are you? Hey, do you want to run off maybe some extra copies just in case we run into anything? So, back, front, and then front. It's a 3-pager. If you want to collate them, that'd be helpful too. Okay, welcome to School of Theology Week 2. What we are going to be looking at tonight in our time together, I don't know how long it'll take us. I kind of expect, and for those of you that have heard me do this before, I do this quite regularly, I kind of expect to be done a little bit early tonight, just to let you know in terms of the scope. I seldom actually accomplish that. But that's just because the Bible is so rich and wonderful and good. So last week we spent a lot of time kind of talking about the origin of humanity, and particularly we were spending our time looking at the book of Genesis and saying, okay, what does Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 teach us about humanity? And tonight what I want us to look specifically at is the question of what does it mean to be made in the image of God, which we actually find first expressly written in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. And we're going to go back and we're going to actually look at that particular text. We got more copies coming, Tammy. And before we do, let me also remind you that as much as I love to have you here, and there is something powerful, as I was describing to Craig before everybody else showed up, there can be something really, really neat about the classroom dynamic. And I think I always learn more kind of in a face-to-face situation than I do any other way. We are actually on Facebook Live. So if you are not able to make it, or if you want to go back and look at one of our lectures or lessons, you can do that. And one of the places that we post them pretty regularly on is our SCC Institute. So if you just go to YouTube and type in SCC Institute, you can see a lot of our material that's there. In one of our meetings today, we were talking about ways of recataloging it. Is that fair to say, Ryan? Yeah. Our SCC Institute stuff. So really hope that, like I said, I love the fact that we have an opportunity to do that. Who else came in? Did somebody else come in, Tara? Okay. Did I miss anybody? Okay. I'm going to leave these over here just in case. So what I want to do tonight is just basically take a look at this pretty important doctrine known as the image of God doctrine, or sometimes you'll hear it in the Latin, kind of just said rather quickly, imago Dei, which is made in the image of God. So image, Dei, God, image, imago. And that's kind of where we take some of our deepest doctrines in terms of the value of human life. And so we're going to take a look at where we find that, and then what essentially that might mean, although it says it quite clearly. There is a lot of theological debate and philosophical reflection on what that might possibly mean. So that's what we're going to be doing. Where do you want to go? We'll put it right here. No problem. So if you have your Bibles, I want you to turn to Genesis chapter 1. We're looking at verse 26 and 27. And as you go there, I want to ask you a couple of questions. Wow, we're going to be... Ryan, would you mind making some more copies? At the copier, making copies. Do you guys remember that? That's old time. That's old school. That's... So here's what I want us to reflect on, and I don't mind a little bit of discussion. So what does it mean, or what makes us essentially human? If you kind of think about that. I don't know if you, I don't know how much you actually reflect on that as you look at us, as you look at how we are different than much of creation. I find it fascinating, and I promise you, for those of you that know me well, I'm not going to chase this rabbit very, very far. But I find it fascinating how our view of the rest of creation has changed just in my lifetime. From the awareness that, man, we should be nice to animals, to we're really no different than any other animals, to actually, I think animals might be better than us. I mean, have you seen this? In a lot of movies, there is almost this that we are the plight of the earth, humanity is. That we are the ones that destroy the planet. No other animal would ever destroy the planet. And so there's almost this, by the way, there's some extra handouts that are coming. So Ryan's ran off to print them. So if you take a look at that, or even how we look at the rest of the creation, and I'll be honest, as much as I can in my head keep most of it straight, I will be honest with you, it has affected me. The way that culture sees it. And I really think there's a strong connection, and kind of work with me on this. I think there is a really strong connection between what Disney has done in terms of how it personifies different inanimate objects like trees or animate objects like animals. And so literally as I do things like chop down trees, I have to admit, I mean, you're going to think I'm absolutely crazy, but I think to myself, I wonder if this tree feels pain that I'm cutting off one of its arms, right? Why? Where would I get that from? Pocahontas, right? I wonder if this tree feels this. If you think about like how much, I won't say who it is, but there are people in my life that I love dearly, and they will refer to some of the animals that live in and around me as being sad, or being happy, or being fulfilled, or being lonely, or being different things, which are interesting. I don't want to chase this too far, but it's really interesting. Like, where would that idea come from? Like, what would make you look at a fish in a fish tank and go, "Wow, I think he's lonely"? And yeah, exactly. Well, because I mean, I would want a friend. Wouldn't you want a friend? Would you want to sit in just a bowl by yourself? You would want, I have gotten my fish friends. So I'm not taking a shot at anybody. I've gotten my fish friends. I've found friends for my grass because they look kind of lonely. And I know how much, grass wants other grass friends to hang out with so they can spend time together. So think about how much like our view of ourselves and how we interact even with creation, how much that has morphed and changed. And I think a lot of it actually has to do with, and this is what I'm more fascinated in, is the way that Disney has personified those things. And so all these animals have lives and feelings and boyfriends and girlfriends and husbands and wives and children, and that's how they think about it, right? You never actually have a Disney thing where like the tiger eats its young, right? You would never do that, because a tiger would never do that. Well, actually, they do that, right? They do that. At least according to a Rodney Dangerfield joke, they do that. So what happens when we look at the created order of things, and this is what I want you to think about. What happens when we look at creation and you create kind of this level playing field where there really is not much of a difference between plant, animal, mammal? Is there any kind of difference at all? Is there any, I'll use a really bad word in our culture, is there any kind of hierarchy that exists within the created order? Or is it a level playing field? And by the way, if you're going, oh yeah, that's those extremists out there, I don't know. I don't know if it's like, it's affecting, it's infecting, it's shaping a lot of our theology in a lot of areas by us creating a level playing field within the created order. And so did we get that idea from the Bible, this level playing field? So going back to the question, what makes us essentially human? And kind of alongside that, like, is there anything that, and now here's what I want to take off the table, kind of the Imago Dei right now, But is there anything else within the created order, in terms of how it's described, that distinguishes us? So before we just even go to the biblical text, how do you begin to sense that there is actually a difference between us and other created things? What are some of the differences?
Morality.
Okay. So a sense of morality, which is kind of an interesting thing.
It's bad for me to eat my child, but it's okay for the tiger.
Okay. we get no sense that when a lion kills a gazelle, that there is some kind of like guilt that pours over it, or even a lion killing another lion. You just don't seem to have that same sense. A spider doesn't grab some insect, spin it up in its web, and then sit over in the corner and just kind of reflect on what it's done and the cost of life. It doesn't seem to be able to do that, does it? And so there is a sense of like how much in the animal world do we have a sense of morality? So that's a great point. Morality. Any other distinctions or differences? Okay, so there is, in essence, like a reason, an ability to reason, right? An ability to think in that sense. Okay?
Certainly abstract thought or ego.
Yeah. Abstract thought. They don't seem to be able to. We discover new things, which is interesting. I'm not saying we don't discover new things to the depths to which animals have been, as we would argue as Christians, created, right, by God with some pretty amazing abilities. Like, let's be honest, some animals can do some pretty amazing things. But they don't seem, as far as we can tell, to be able to do complicated math problems. Not that I know of, anyway. And you said? Creativity. Now, but can't we look at like a spider and go, it's creative? You don't think so? So explain a little bit of the difference, because I agree with you, but explain a little bit of the difference.
Right. I guess it's part of its nature and how it survives, but for us it more describes our existence.
Yeah, yeah.
And, I don't know, solving problems, being creative in that fashion too.
Well, see, here's what I would say. It'd be really interesting if a spider created a web, but then actually, why does it use that web? It seems to be a pretty one-dimensional way. So it looks like a creativity, but it appears to be tied more to its instinctive pattern, as opposed to, we were in a meeting regarding the building, and somebody made a comment. Ryan, I wish you were here right now. He left. But some amazing architect, and somebody made a comment about his designs, and I said, I don't even know who that is. And Ryan showed me the pictures of what this guy can design, and it was ridiculous in terms of the amount of creative ability that he actually had. Okay? So these are a number of them. I mean, we're gonna even talk about some more of them. So there seems to be something that is in fact unique or distinct. And I would even say, kind of ahead of the curve, let's be careful trying to find just one thing that distinguishes. I think that kind of reductionistic thinking, it can be dangerous. It seems like what the Bible describes is more of a fundamental difference than just one thing that might set us apart or make us specifically different. I think it's good for you to think about, like, what is it that makes you different than the rest of the created order? Because in that differentiation, we can actually find like true worth or true value. It helps us even understand, like, what we love to talk about in our culture, the unique things that we, even as, you know, there's a uniqueness between us. And when I sit down with a group of 4 people like this, we can really be an amazing team if I can figure out what unique things I bring to the table and what unique things you bring to the table. We can function better as a team if we each put the unique abilities that happen here. So when humanity decides, for some reason, to level the playing field, we may actually lose what is distinctively different by God's design about us. So what happens when all of a sudden we remove that, when we kind of treat everything as a level playing field? We actually diminish something. So what looks like this desire or this goal to create a level playing field so that everything gets treated fairly or everything gets treated properly, one of the problems with that is, what if not everything is equal? If we begin to do that, we might actually lose something that God is specifically building everything around. And so one of the questions that we're going to keep coming back to as we look at these questions is, does the Bible speak that way about humanity? Does the Bible consider us to be just like everything else? Or does the Bible seem to like put us in a different place? Here's another question, like for us to think about. We're not going to fully unpack this one tonight, but I think it definitely has some implications in our material tonight on the image of God. But does the Bible describe our nature both before and after the fall? So does the Bible describe our nature pre-fall, and then does the Bible describe our nature post-fall? Meaning, specifically, like what changes and what remains the same? Because that's going to be an important distinction that's made. So when the Bible describes, in essence, who we are, and the Bible looks at us in the text that describes the fall is Genesis 3. What are some of the distinctive lists or characteristics of humanity before Genesis 3? So Genesis 1 and 2. And then, actually these should be on the other side. How is humanity described before that? And then how is humanity described after that? What stays on this side of the line and what carries over onto the other one? So in essence what I'm asking is, do we lose something in our image bearing because we have lived post Adam and Eve eating of the fruit? So is there something that we have actually literally lost? And is it possible that what we actually lost was the image of God? Is, I think, at least a question that we need to actually deal with. Another major question, man, my markers are running out here. Another major question that we have to at least ask and be prepared to deal with in terms of like what makes us uniquely human, or what is our nature, and we're not just talking about our physicality, we're going to be dealing with this tonight, is our nature essentially good or evil? What is our nature? And then obviously we have to answer that question in terms of what does it say here and what does it say here? Is there a difference between the way humanity is described in Genesis 1 and 2? And then all of a sudden on the other side of the fall, does it describe us in another way? So we're going to be looking at that particular, in that particular frame of reference. And then the last thing, and I want to spend a little bit of time discussing this, why do you think it matters so much that the Bible describes us as being made in the image of God? Like, why might that matter more than we realize? Did you get a handout? Oh, you did get one, okay. Why does it matter so much? Let's think about why that theological doctrine, as you've heard us teach here quite a bit, that our orthodoxy, right belief, so impacts our orthopraxy, our practice of our faith, our right practice of our faith. Why is the image of God, why might it matter in terms of some of the things that we believe about that? Where are some areas in which it's going to have some ramifications or some implications? Can you see any before we kind of talk specifically what it might mean?
Like our identity.
Okay. So when you say identity, kind of unpack that a little bit more, Tara.
Well, trying to be more like Jesus, trying to be holy.
Okay.
What the Holy Spirit tells.
Okay. You talk about holiness, which is kind of interesting because that's a characteristic that God, it's only characteristic of God mentioned 3 times. Holy, 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 which in Hebrew is known as the superlative, meaning holiest. Okay? The way that they describe an increasing value in something is by repeating the word. Okay? And so it's very interesting that repeating 3 times is it to the nth degree, right? Fully or completely. And holy is the thing that describes God. Okay? So our identity. Anything else in terms of, no, keep going.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we're reflecting him.
Okay? And so tell me how that fits. What are some of the implications?
Well, if we are made in the image of God, and we're image bearers. So if God is love, then we're called to be love. If God is just, then we're called to be just. So on and so forth.
So there is a natural application of our understanding of this doctrine. There is I would even say like a natural accountability in some sense as well then. And so when the Bible describes kind of this God on the one hand, therefore you, right? Think about how many times this happens. God is holy, what? Therefore, you be holy. God is, therefore, you. This is Paul's actually, some of his language in the book of Ephesians. God is light, therefore, you should be children of light. God is love, therefore what? You use that example. Therefore, love should be something that it's not we feel, we act in a loving way. So there is an implication there. I'll tell you, here's another thing on identity. It's so far when we've been talking about identity, we have been describing more of an action and a projection of, take a look at me, London, watch me, and you'll be able to know what God is like. But there's another way that we talk about identity, right? We put the word self in front of it. How do we self-identify? Right? Do you know people that describe or really kind of wrestle with self-esteem? Have you heard of this? People that have a poor self-image, right? Do you know of any Christians that wrestle with image? Think about it. I mean, honestly, this is a profound concept. So anyone that wrestles with image or worth, and here's the part that I find fascinating. So let's do some application here. Little Jimmy over here really is kind of wrestling with his worth because he doesn't know where his worth is coming from. And nobody seems to like him like they like the other kids, and nobody seems to... How do you build his identity or his self-worth? Or how does... not you. How does society, everybody else but you, how do they try to build him up?
It's all relative. The happiness or what that's about.
Yeah. So here's how they try to actually make him feel better is they try to describe the things that he does that is unique or the specialness in him, right? Well, look at what and here's what's fascinating. We tell kids all the time, like, it's not what you can do. It's not what you can do. And then when we try to build their self-worth, how do we do it? Well, you can do special things. You can do. One of the most interesting encounters I ever had was with a woman who came to me one time and she said, I would like for you to meet with my son. And he's really wrestling. He's in junior high and he's really wrestling with some self-worth issues. Would you mind meeting with him? She's a very nice lady. And I said, I'd love to meet with him. So I met with her son and I figured out what the problem was. It was actually rather simple. I mean, the implications kind of ran deep, but the idea was rather simple. And I told him I was going to meet back with his mom. And so she comes back to my office about a week later. She says, so what's wrong? And I said, he figured out that you're lying to him all the time. And she goes, what? I don't lie to my son. I said, oh, really? I thought you did. I thought you told him that he was really good looking. And she said, well, I do. He's the most beautiful young man in the world. I said, yeah, no, he wanted to talk about that actually, because like none of the girls at the junior high think he's that. Like he's really struggling with the way that he looks. And when you tell him like he's the most beautiful guy in the whole junior high, he just kind of goes, oh, but mom, you're my mom. How many of you know what I'm talking about? Right? Like so, and then I guess you told him that he was going to make the basketball team because he's probably the best basketball player. And guess what? This is true. Didn't make the team. And so he's kind of figured out like everything you say to him is well intended, but it's just not true. And she started to cry. Well, I was just trying to be a good mom. Listen, I mean, I'm a lying parent myself. I know what you're doing. But when our kid, what happens when, how many of you figured out that your parents have been lying to you about who you are? Right? You know what I'm talking about. So what's fascinating is, and this really kind of cuts us to our core, even though we believe things about being made in the image of God and our worth is more than that, when push comes to shove, how do we build the esteem of those around us?
God created you and He doesn't make mistakes.
I wish we did that. I think that's how we should do it, to be honest with you. Yeah. But it's interesting. And if you don't believe me, just spend like 4 seconds on Facebook. And you can see how Christian people try to build one another up. And by the way, I'm not even saying that we should never compliment one another or we should never, I'm not saying that. So don't read this too. I'm not saying that. I'm going, but what happens when we try to build these things up? You are so creative and you are so gifted. And you've heard that a lot about you. And that's who he is. And then all of a sudden, for whatever reason, you can't do that anymore. Right? There's a guy on staff, I don't think he'll mind me saying this. He absolutely thought that baseball was everything for him. And he was a good baseball player. And then next thing you know, he's at Starbucks with me. And he was trying to walk on at Oklahoma State. And God was doing something in his heart. And he just said, man, I'm trying to figure out who I am now. I don't know who I am. Because I've literally been a baseball player for so long. I don't know who I am anymore. So all of us have this. Every single one of us have this. Like I thought I was and then you can fill in the blank. I thought I was a husband, but then my wife died. So what happens when we build our identity on something other than the foundational picture? This is what happens. Is everything else can be stripped away. Tell me something that can't be stripped away. Good looks? Intelligence? Ability? I had a conversation one time. My wife, I don't think she likes the story, but she was mentoring a number of college girls, and Mackenzie was about in the 4th grade, I think. And I could just see these girls, oh, you're so cute, you're in the 4th, whatever, And I came over and I just kind of said to Mackenzie in front of the girls, son, you're really not that special. And everybody's like shocked that I said that. And I asked the question, I said, son, and again, it's fun with a 4th grader, tell me what you can do that you don't think anybody else in the world can do. And he just kind of looked at me. And by the way, this is where some value, this is the beauty of going, son, this is why, it really doesn't matter what you do. It really doesn't matter. There is something that is intrinsic in you that it's not even if somebody else recognizes that specialness. What if somebody doesn't realize someone else is special? Are they still special? And this is the difference. This is the difference. I began to tell my son, instead of you're special and then pointing to something, I would talk about him being special and I would point back to my love for him, or I would talk about God's design for him. And it was, I didn't want it to be tied to some kind of achievement or some kind of accomplishment or some kind of physical attribute. I want it to be tied to something that no one could ever strip away. So do you see how important that having a healthy understanding of image bearer, and an identity is not just what we project? Totally love it. But have you ever just stopped? It's kind of like the lesson I had on Sunday, for those of you that were here on Sunday. How many times I've read Acts chapter 11 and just thought, yeah, we probably should take the gospel to other people. Instead of going, no, I'm the Gentile. I'm the Gentile. Somehow it came to me. Why did I read this text and not kind of just wrestle with my Gentileness? When was the last time you felt greater value or worth because you were made in the image of God? You were. Not your kids, you were. And your worth and your value is not what somebody else esteems you as, but the all-knowing, all-powerful creator of the universe. I like how you said it, Tara. We say it so glibly, but how about this idea that God doesn't make mistakes? So there's a young man in our congregation named Luke Carpenter. And Luke was born, I can't even like restate what his disease was or what his ailment, whatever you call it. They just found out recently what it is. But you might see Luke kind of wandering around or just looking backwards in a pew, which is my favorite view of Luke Carpenter. He just likes to turn around and look backwards. And I can't wait to see him on the other side of eternity, because I'm just fascinated by things that he might know or that God might even reveal to him that I'll never know until the other side. Like, does he have any value if no one recognizes his value? See, and the Bible speaks to that, doesn't it? The Bible totally speaks to that. That's why these questions can become far more substantial. Any last thoughts before we run through our texts and some other questions regarding? I've already got my kids out of the house, but I hope for those of you that were hearing me about how to parent that you go back and, actually maybe we should even do that to our kids now. Go back and remind them we love them, not because of what they do, but because of the fact that they were made in the image of God. So let's look at God's Word. As this class really wants to find its roots in kind of in the biblical text itself. One of the things that I want you to kind of hold on to, because I think it's good to be honest about some things. There are some doctrines that are really built from a lot of texts. And then there are some very important doctrines that are only built from a few texts. And this is one of those big important doctrines that is only built from a few texts, to be honest with you. So there appears to be things that kind of run through the Bible that draw back to this. And that's what I kind of want to do at the very end. I want to kind of go back and say, it's very interesting that as we look at building up this case for human worth, that it's not just that the Bible says, you are made in the image of God and therefore you have human worth. It's way deeper than that. Is that what we're going to be looking at is some of the foundational texts that talk about us being made in the image of God. And then a number of other texts that seem to imply that they're drawing their thinking back upon this foundational one that comes from Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Okay? And as you noticed last week, we described many things in the same way. There are some of these foundational things that come out of Genesis 1 and 2. Even the uniqueness of man and woman, kind of the differentiation between man and woman, that is found foundationally in the Genesis text, even though I think it's just describing something. It's just kind of describing something that is. There seems to be almost well, shouldn't it be that way, implied from the text. And so many other times Jesus describes in the very beginning, and he points back to doctrines that come from Genesis chapter 1 and 2. So Genesis chapter 1, what does God say? Beginning in verse 26 and 27. Again, we looked at these verses last week to talk about God being the creator and us being created. Then God said, very interesting, second word in the text. What is it? Is that kind of strange? Who's he talking to? Himself. Which is kind of, think about the depths of that, right? Who is God talking to? Himself. Okay, but he didn't say I, let me. What does he say? Let us. Which by the way, I think is going to help us maybe explain a little bit of what's happening here on the Imago Dei. Okay? So that's not just a small thing. Okay? One of the things, and this is kind of from our Trinitarian class, but I think it might be helpful because I think one of the ideas, I'll just write it here, we'll come back to it later. The relational element is another kind of a idea of what it might actually mean for us to be made in God's image. The word for God is El, okay? Where you even get like Baal is kind of like a derivative of that same concept. So El is God. And I'll just, if you don't mind, I'm going to put a small g because it doesn't have to be Yahweh God, right? So it could just be God. And then you may have heard that term, Elohim. Elohim is another word for God, interestingly enough. But this here is literally a way of making a word plural. So that HM, okay? That HM. So I'll give you a one that everybody knows. Avram is the name for Abraham, which which means what? Father. Father of lots, meaning kind of like to pluralize it, is Avraham. Avraham. So father of many. So that's how you do it. So it's very interesting that God, and in a sense, gods, Elohim is another word for God, which people have conversations regarding. Isn't it interesting that sometimes God is called El and other times that God is called Elohim? And there's a lot of debate about this. I won't say this actually proves it, because this word, as I said earlier, could actually mean, by pluralizing it, could make it a superlative, meaning it's greatest. I also believe that what it's describing, the use of Elohim, is the plurality, not the multiplicity, not three gods, right? But that there is, in fact, in God more than one, right? And so I love that, the kind of that idea that exists. Let us, God speaks, and the rest of the Bible says that there's something there. So even when we're talking about let us make man in our image, some people think he might be speaking to the angels. And I do believe there is like even a common denominator actually between angels and humans. Whenever there is an encounter in the Bible with someone with an angel, they're usually mistaken for what? Other people, right? They're mistaken for other people. They thought they saw another person, then they ended up going, wow, that was somebody else. And then actually they think sometimes that was God. So there is a kind of this common denominator which might describe a little bit of our physical characteristics. But God is making something uniquely with humanity. In verse 26, let us make man in our image. And by the way, I think that word there for man is actually demonstrating not just the male gender, but that. Now, the word is man. Don't get me wrong, Adam. But it seems to be describing something a little bit wider than that. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and see, this is why I think it's more than just singular man. And let us make what? Them. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And so there we have a little bit of a differentiation between humanity and everything else, which I think we need to acknowledge. And then the second thing is that we see how, in terms of how it continues, verse 27, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So one of the things that's very important for us to see, and by the way, it's kind of an easy thing, but let's just make sure we're all clear on this. Like God himself may be described in the masculine, but God is not male. Do you kind of get that? Now, Jesus was, right? Jesus was a male. But God himself, the Bible makes it very, very clear. God is not a what? He likes to say this, I'm not a man. Like I'm not a man. You don't ever make anything in my image. Why? Because I don't have like a body like that. Like I'm not a man. Now, Jesus was a man. Okay? So I'm not trying to question that. But God himself is not a man. Okay, and he describes some specific traits in terms of that. But what God we see doing here is emphasizing this uniqueness of the image, and the image of God that we see here. Where can I write it? The image of God, male and female. And this is going to be very, very, very important. Which one is made in God's image? And the answer is yes. Like both. Which then says something, that what God is describing, or even what God is creating in this, or in this, has a reflection of who he is. So it has, I think, theologically, okay, forget what even culture says. Theologically, the Bible seems to demand that I look at humanity and I see the image of God, not men. I'm not anti-men, okay? I know there's some men I actually like. But the truth is that men are not in the image of God. Humanity has been made in the image of God. So it has to, I believe, theologically, it has to transcend gender, right? It has to transcend that. There's something that transcends that even in God's own nature. So we can recognize that. Also look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. Here's another text that kind of has us kind of force with what kind of who we are, kind of our identity. The Bible says, then the Lord, and notice L-O-R-D in capitals. So this is why it's kind of good for you to see. When it says Lord God, it literally says Yahweh El. Okay? Lord God. And so Yahweh God is kind of how you would actually translate that, right? Yahweh God. Or it would say Yahweh Elohim, Yahweh God. Okay? Now, one of the reasons why that is so important is because that we recognize that this is his name, and this is, in essence, what he is. Okay? This is his name, and this is what he is. Jim Human, Yahweh God. So when you're reading that in the text, one very important, I love this, when Elijah is on Mount Carmel and they're getting into this big argument. And what does Elijah say? Hey, you prophets, you go over there, and if what? If Baal is El, then but if Yahweh is El, so God is kind of the kind of being that he is, like human is the kind of being that we are, and Yahweh is who he is. So as the text continues, then Yahweh God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. So one of the things that this emphasizes is in terms of like what is our essence. This is kind of interesting. Our essence is more than, can I say it? Yeah, I guess. Our essence is more than just the imago Dei. That there are, in fact, that we see this, and it kind of goes back to that creator-created distinction, is that our created nature then has a limit in terms of who we are and what we can do. So we are made from dust. So from dust we were made, and what does the Bible say? To dust we will return. So there is something that is, by the way, and I don't know if you feel this way, but there is something really kind of awesome and incredible, man, made in the image of God. Like, isn't that great? Now, one of the major problems that we're going to see in the Bible is that people who are made in the image of God struggle with this, and what do they begin to presume? Say it louder, Tammy. That they are gods, right? Like, this is actually a common theme that we will find in the Bible. In the Tower of Babel, what are they going to do? Hey, we won't be scattered. Adam and Eve, what's the temptation? We too will be like God, knowing the difference between good and evil. And so one of the problems is if we have this identity, that's why I think it's really interesting that one of the major temptations and one of the major failures that is happening in our world is this kind of this divine inner reflection that we have. So you can take, quote unquote, the image of God too far, can you not? See, what happens if you take Genesis 1:27 and it so overpowers Genesis 2:7? See, do you see the problem there? That's why I want us to see that it's just kind of a Jim Johnson thing. I'm not a big fan of balance. I'm a big fan of integration. Okay? Which literally means I don't believe that we're over here dust and we're also over here image of God, like somehow we're in this kind of, and we go back and forth between dust and image and dust and image. No, the truth is I'm both. Like I'm an integrated being. I am an image bearer of God, made from dust, who will return to dust. And that's who I am. So we have to hold, it's the beauty of great doctrines, we have to hold both of these things in tension. This is my amazing worth. These are my overpowering limitations. This is how much God loves and cares for me. These are the great things that I can do. And these are the things that I really, really like wrestle with and I'll never be able to overcome. Both of these find their very roots in the Genesis material. Made in the image of God, from dust to dust. Thoughts about that? Any reflection?
I say having a body is very important to being a man as well as spiritual.
Okay.
Does that tie into the resurrection?
Well, we are going to actually talk about that, actually. We are going to talk about that. It's interesting that when you think about it, for whatever reason, and then, by the way, there's some questions. I remember going over to see my good friends, the Blakes, because their daughter was asking this wonderful question, who made God? Phenomenal question. I mean, I really love that we're able to ask those questions. Every one of us has thought about that question, right? Well, who made God? And before we ever read Thomas Aquinas' work on the uncaused cause or the unmoved mover, we actually had to just wrestle with it as children. You know what I mean? And so as we're... Okay, that was funnier, guys. Thank you. Thank you very much for... Don't shake your head. It was funny. So there are some questions that we're not going to be able to get kind of to the bottom to. Like, why did God give us bodies? I don't know. He definitely doesn't have one. But if you think about it, in terms of like the difference between him and us, God, who is everywhere, in essence, then what could he not have? Like a body. That's why when you think about it, this is one of the most amazing things about the incarnation, is that Jesus Christ emptied himself and was made in the image of God, or made in the form. Actually, the Greek word there is the word morphe, the form of God. Even though he was in the form of God, was made into the morphe of man, the image of man. So Jesus takes on this body. And so body is something that is very, very, very important for theology within the entire Bible.
And the dust. It goes back to the dust.
Yeah, goes back to the dust. And that's why I think it's important that this will actually feed into our understanding of what eternal life looks like. And it's a little bit outside of our scope, but it actually at least probably deserves a quick mention. Look at Psalm 104:29. This kind of shows like the value and the sustenance of God over creation. When you hide your face, they are dismayed. When you take away their breath, they die and return to the dust. Kind of their way of describing humanity. Okay? So let's go over. We've already kind of talked about this a little bit. How does Genesis 1:27 differentiate humanity from the rest of creation? It is, in fact, the Imago Dei. So we've already discussed that. It is, in fact, made in the image of God, is the big thing that the text describes there being a difference. And we're going to unpack that here in a second. So number one, made in the image of God. Another major issue, though, that I want to kind of put alongside of that is that we are made in the image of God to subdue the earth, to demonstrate dominion over it. And then going back a little bit to what Chris was describing in terms of the creative element of it, there appears to be this, we are God's representatives subduing the earth. We are God's representatives working the earth. We are God's representatives kind of cultivating the earth for his glory, is basically the concept that we actually have here. Which, by the way, then goes back and it takes care of some of the concerns that people rightly have today. That when you hear words like subdue or have dominion over, it really doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want to the planet. Does it? That's why, going back to what we learned last week, the creator-created distinction, whose planet is it? It's God's, it's not mine. So be very careful what you do with God's stuff, right? Like, be very careful how you... I remember when I was a little boy, I was fascinated by magnifying glasses, and my dad caught me one time just... What was I doing? Burning ants. So you just find little animals and you just... And I'll never forget, my dad about lost his mind that I did this. And I'll never forget him giving me this incredibly... And my dad was not some kind of like PETA representative. Okay? By no stretch of the imagination. But my dad, I remember him, I still remember this. What is wrong with you that you would take delight in destroying God's creation. Now, by the way, it's not like he didn't believe we should squash a mosquito, but my dad would be like, but why would you take delight? Why would you take delight? And I'll never forget that. My dad just kind of saw that there was just something that was bigger than. Like none of this was ours. This was God's world. And that's taken from this doctrine. So when God made the world, and we see this incredible creativity, and then he says to us, I want us, we're made in his image. We are going to be his representatives. We are going to be as though he is here. So he is the one that is creative. He is the one that is caring for. He is the one that is showing dominion over. He is the one that has done all of this. By the way, for his glory. And as you hear me say all the time, for his glory, others benefit and our joy. Like that's kind of how God is constantly operating. And so when we hold to this very important view of how the world was made and why the world was made and how we fit into it, all of a sudden we become these image bearers, reflectors of our Creator. So does our Creator destroy things? Manipulate things? Exploit things? And the answer is what? No. He doesn't do that. Therefore, we should not be destroyers, manipulators, abusers. Okay? So it really comes back to this, which, by the way, then we got to be careful that we don't turn the creation into something greater than it is. Oh yeah, that's because creation is holy. No, it's not. It's not. And there is a major distinction in the image-bearing aspect of it. So we'll see the Bible actually kind of unfolds from that. It says, okay, here's the value of creation. Here is the value of humanity. Here's why creation has value and worth, because it displays the glory of God. Here is how humanity has value and worth, because it displays the image of God. And this is how creation is designed to actually work in unison with one another, as opposed to any kind of conflict, at least before the fall. And then we'll see some conflict developing. So what are some possible explanations for the image of God? And there are a couple of them that we've already kind of discussed. And I want to kind of look at some of these, and we've already discussed in terms of seeing them as some strong possibilities. First of all, number one, the capacity for reason. So that kind of extra level thinking, definitely. Like that was here's what I find interesting. That was a real popular way of describing the Imago Dei when reason really mattered to people. As I kind of went back doing my study for this tonight, it was really interesting how whatever the people love to emphasize are the traits that they are really excited about. So Enlightenment thinkers, and there were some even in the early few hundred years of the church, they loved this ability to reason and to think. Okay? And that became one of these major attributes, which, by the way, there is a capacity that I don't think we could argue about that. Another one would be the concept of immortality, especially going back and seeing what's actually happening here in Genesis 3 in terms of what is gained and lost. That there seems to be, now, by the way, immortal is not the same thing as this concept of being able to go back forever. So an immortality is that once life has begun, then it will always exist. Does that make sense? Immortal does not go backwards into eternity. It only moves forward into eternity. Okay? So don't think immortal, I've always existed. No, immortal is I will live forever. That's the immortality piece. And the question becomes then, there's lots of doctrines around this, is that if we are going to live forever, the ultimate question then that we have to ask is, like, where will we live forever? Where will we live forever? And the Bible gives some directions that time and the plans and the purposes of God are heading towards. And so if everyone made in his image has value and worth and will exist ongoing forever, then wow. I mean, there's obviously some deep ramifications in terms of that, right? Some deep, important decisions that we need to make. So immortality becomes one of those ideas. And by the way, let me make it clear, the Bible never says the Imago Dei is reason, or the Imago Dei is immortality, or the Imago Dei, the Bible describes us as being reasonable, or the ability, having the capacity for reason. The Bible describes the fact that there is this ongoing life that we have even after death. The Bible describes that. Next, consciousness. And kind of alongside that idea of consciousness is like this idea of self-awareness. That is something that is very unique within humanity, is that we are self-aware. Okay? I know you really know a lot of people. You're like, really? I don't think he's very self-aware. But no, he is aware, or she is aware that they do exist. They kind of see, in essence, like where they fit into. There's that ability to kind of self-reflect on kind of where they fit into the world. And then the concept of freedom is something that a lot of scholars wrote about. So is there something unique about the freedom that we have? Think about it. In terms of the way that the serpent lied to Adam and Eve, what did he say to them? Is that when you eat of this, you will become like gods because you will what? Know the difference between good and evil. So by the way, freedom doesn't mean sin. You can have freedom and choose two good options, by the way. But is there a sense, and this is kind of what's interesting, when you kind of talk about us outside of the animal realm, that we are not instinctive only. We may have instinctive parts within us, but we really have the ability to kind of override much of the instinctive parts of us. And so there is this freedom that we actually have to make choice, or a freedom actually is tied very closely to what you described, Chris, on the creativity. There's a freedom for us to think outside of the box. If we were spiders, so to speak, we'd use our webs for more than just catching things and living, right? We could make a spaceship out of a spider web and fly to the moon or something. Next, dominion is another thing. That there is kind of this ruling aspect. Like if you think about the world, like nothing else seems to have this incredible ability to like dominate its surroundings with a sense of intentionality. And this is what I know you might argue with me, and you'd be partly right. Almost everything else that dominates like that, it becomes incredibly destructive, right? When something tips. It almost becomes this devouring thing. And there's, by the way, a lot of stuff about what is actually going on with human trends in terms of like population and other stuff that I think would shock many of you. There's a great book that I'm reading right now called Factfulness about population trends and things like that would probably blow your mind. That you'd be really surprised at some of the almost natural limitations that seem to be we're now beginning to figure out in terms of where humanity is going, in terms of numbers and growth and abilities. There's some fascinating stuff about it. But there is this dominion that we seem to have, that God calls us to and that we are able to do. So these are some different ways. And if I were to ask you, like, which one do you really think describes us in terms of as being image bearers of God? Probably every single one of us might have something. So here's what I want to do, is I want to look at Psalm chapter 8, verses 3 through 8, and just take a look at what the Scriptures describe in a psalm. So it's this beautiful picture, this beautiful description of what the psalmist is kind of reflecting on the bigness of God and the strongness of humanity as well. And so what does he say? Who wants to read nice and loud? Psalm chapter 8, verses 3 through 8. Go ahead.
When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings, and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the sea.
So, by the way, just before when you read that, and how you should read Hebrew poetry, when it says you put everything under him, and then you go, wow, and you just take that and run with it. Absolutely everything? No. The everything is about to be described. So the everything that's described in the text is everything in the world. Okay? So don't just go everything, and that includes the devil, and that includes... No. It's described. The everything is described afterwards. So it seems to be that the Bible wants to almost sit back and take a look and say, wow, like the amazing nature. What is man that you are mindful of him, the son of man that you care for him? You made a little lower than the heavenly angels, and you've crowned him with glory and with honor. I would argue that one of the problems of looking at any one of these issues, reason, immortality, consciousness, freedom, creativity, dominion, however you want to describe it, fails to understand that being made in the image of God is more than one thing, but is most likely a combination of a number of attributes that we share with our Creator. And so I think the reason why so many of these things have value and worth is because the answer is yes and. Because another one that I didn't kind of put on this list, but I wrote up here, is the relational aspect that humans have. Capacity for relationships. I know what you're thinking. Your cat really loves you. No way. There's no way you'd think a cat loves you. Your dog really loves you. That one actually looks a little more obvious. Dogs seem to like people. Cats don't at all. But the major problem for any of these one things is just it seems to limit, and it seems to almost be tied up in one particular time that sees a certain attribute as over and more valuable than others. Reason, relational abilities, creativity. And it seems like what God is doing and what God is describing and what the Bible seems to talk about all the way through are these multifaceted ideas. I think the image of God is far more than one thing, but is a highly intricate combination of a number of things. So how do we have a more broad understanding? I think it's important that we recognize that. I could go off on that, but I will not. So as we kind of wrap this up, going back to the body question that was brought up earlier, there is something that is kind of important for us to see, and we'll see kind of where it begins to fit into our conversation. When we think about what are we made of in terms of our elements, if I were to say, what is a human, and what are we made of? And we kind of move a little bit beyond the image of God. We recognize that everybody's made in the image of God, but we are usually divided up into flesh and what? Not bone, spirit. That's kind of where we go, okay? So what I want to talk about is something that is known as the dichotomy of humanity. But then there's another issue. Like, what might be missing? Are we made up of two elements, i.e. the physical part of me? So I have a physical part, a flesh. And then I have, there's something more, right? Which is interesting because the word spirit, pneuma, pneumonia, what's the word? The word pneuma can also be translated what? Breath. Which is where we get the word spirit. The breath. So God, think about it in terms of and God breathed into the dust, and from His breath, humanity was made. He breathed life. Spirit. Kind of an interesting idea. So there is this flesh speak, but we're really not just talking about my lungs, contracting and, it's not just that physical act. There's something about my breath. If I stop breathing, you're like, oh my goodness, you're going to die. Your breath is going to stop. So that's kind of how we get some of those ideas from. So do we look at ourselves and see us as flesh and spirit? That would be a dichotomist, that every human is made out of flesh and spirit, flesh and spirit, flesh and spirit. But there's another way of looking at it, is not just flesh and spirit, but flesh. What might be missing? Can anybody think of something that's missing? Soul. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, oh, give me a break. You theologians, which I'm actually, I shouldn't say that. I am a theologian. I'm not a scholar. But a theologian is somebody who thinks about God. You do know that, right? So hopefully we're all theologians. The question is, are you a good theologian? I'm not a scholar, but I am a theologian because I think about God all the time. Is it flesh and spirit and soul? Is that how we understand who we are? And here's why it can sometimes matter for us, because when we're trying to look at not just where we have come from, but even in terms of where we're going, it helps us understand kind of the makeup of the human, not just the human body, but the human, I guess. Let me say that. What actually consists of who we are. For example, one of the reasons why it is so easy for us to almost leave this behind, how many of you know of doctrines or ideas that kind of leave this behind in the afterlife? Can we be fully human without this? See, some are saying yes and some are saying no. So we know that God gave us one. And what happens at the end of time? The end of time. We get one back. So, I mean, literally, most of our doctrines, which kind of have this, which one's better? Which one's more you? And by the way, I know that you might think, okay, that's a trick question, but I think we kind of have some of that in us. So that's why it's good for us to think through these different ideas. So obviously this one is kind of a normal one. This would be then the physical aspect of who we are, right? The physical aspect of who we are. And then this one here, interestingly enough, is usually, well, let me jump to this one here. For someone who is a trichotomist, okay, who really kind of sees us as three, they consider this then to be our reason, kind of our moral capabilities, is our soul. The Greek word for flesh is sarx. And the Greek word for soul is psyche. And the pneuma, in some theologians' minds, is that which then bridges the two. Okay? They even love to talk about that the pneuma, the Spirit, is what kind of holds the Trinity together. You might go, that's a little far-fetched. I kind of think so too, but I see where they're coming from. That you have the sarx. Wonder if that's Jesus. You have the psyche. I wonder if that's the Father. And then you have the pneuma. Some have said that. Okay, I'm not telling you that's what the Bible teaches, but that's kind of where they're going. But I want to look at a couple of verses before we just kind of throw this out one way or the other. You can actually look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 23. 1 Thessalonians 5:23. It's one of my favorite verses in the Bible, actually. And how does it read? What does it say? May your... Who's got it? What does it say? Kate, nice and loud.
Whole spirit and soul and body.
May your whole spirit and soul and body. So how many things does Paul list? Spirit, soul, and body. Describing all three aspects. What does Hebrews chapter 4, verse 12 say that God's word can divide? For the word of God is a double-edged sword. And what does it divide? Soul and spirit. So most of us, so where do we, if you're a dichotomist, by the way, if you're a dichotomist, which before I came up here, most of us were probably dichotomists, okay? How many of you kind of saw it, or maybe even still see it like this? Right? There's the sarx, and then you have the pneuma psyche, which is kind of, how many of you kind of think that the spirit and the soul are kind of describing the same thing? Yeah, I mean, that's the majority of people actually kind of look at it that way. I don't know if I know the answer to this. I mean, you're going to meet people that are going to try to answer some of this. So I just want you to be aware. It's something that is actually talked about, that you see even Bible verses that describe it. There are other Bible verses, and I don't have the whole list for it. If you really want me to give you the whole list, I can give you the whole list, where it seems to describe these two as somewhat synonymous. Jesus talks, and in a couple of places where he's describing the spirit and the soul, it's not like they're just talking about two different things. It's like they're talking about the exact same thing. And so you really got to be careful making too much, especially in terms of how the Bible is describing something, and it's wanting to, well, even the you guys know Sharp's rule from grammar, two nouns with a conjunction in the middle, they're describing the same thing. So even the idea of separating spirit and soul, or soul and spirit, they could literally be describing the same thing, even grammatically in English. So it's not as easily defined.
What would you say on the three one? What would you give a brief definition of spirit?
So spirit is, and this is where they have a really hard time explaining it, okay? So the only reason why I do is because they all do. It's the unifying bridge between the two. This unknown other that I can't really put into words, that I can't really explain. One of the words they love to use for this is the mediator between the two. Okay? So kind of, and not the mediator like the two are fighting, but it's the bridge that kind of brings the two of them together. Okay? So where does this have value or worth? Can I say this is the part that I really, really love? is that I don't know. I mean, I'm probably more of a dichotomist, although I got a little confused this afternoon when I was reading and thought, oh, that's kind of... Paul does some really cool stuff where he describes, in 1 Corinthians, he describes the sarkikos, the pneumatikos, and he talks about the fleshly man, the spiritual man, and the natural man. And he uses pseumatikos, the pneumatikos, and the sarkikos. And so he seems to describe three different kinds of people in terms of how they're looking at the world. And so I thought that was really interesting, but you're not going to go there. So we just kind of leave that beside. But here, can I give you some value? Can I give you some really worth? So this is where this really matters. So here's what I want you to take home, is that we're not just this. Like, we're not. So any kind, and here's where it really begins to matter. Like, I couldn't stop myself. Like, so much of our thinking, again, like defies biblical doctrines. No, you actually could help yourself. I've had people tell me this. I really couldn't help myself. And I went, really? So if I got your girlfriend and you in my office right now, you couldn't control yourselves? Well, no. Okay, then don't tell me you couldn't control yourself. Like, you can control yourself. Like, you're not just a flesh being. You're not just an animal. You're not just instinctive. There's more than that in you. Is there not? That comes to worth. So we're not just this. So any kind of like doctrine or philosophy that limits us to this, which so much of what the world is trying to teach us right now is based upon this doctrine, that we are physical, done. And then what happens if we go, yeah, this really doesn't matter? And by the way, there's a kind of a weird not even new, but there's a weird spiritualism that exists where we kind of lift up, whether you want to call it spirit and soul or spirit soul, where all of a sudden the physical doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you do with your physical body. It really is your spirit. And many of us actually kind of lift that up in terms of even how things are going to end for eternity. And we're going to kind of float around like sky angels, which is not a real biblical concept. So we cannot like divide this. We may kind of wrestle with what do we do with the two of these. I get that. I'm fine with that. Okay? I think the biblical text, it's complicated. But to try to reduce us to one, to try to kind of separate or make a distinction between them, because there is something known as the intermediate state that the Apostle Paul talks about. So there is something, John describes it in Revelation chapter 20, verses 4 through 6, as the soul, the psyche, and I saw in heaven the souls of those. And before the second resurrection happens, in which they receive their bodies, he sees the souls before the throne. So there is something there, but it's not our final state, by the way. So it's important that we recognize, yes, we are, but we are also, as we try to hold together like a good doctrine of humanity. Okay? Made in the image of God, more than just the physical, but we're physical. More than just what we call the spiritual, but the spiritual. Particularly within Jewish thinking. I remember Andrew and I were having our piano tuned years ago when we were living in Ipava, Illinois, and this gentleman asked if I believed in, he was a part of the church of the Abrahamic faith. And he asked me if I believed in life without a body. And I'd never heard of this kind of group of Christians before. And he strongly believed that there was no existence apart from the body. And I thought, I've never heard that before. I know a lot of Christians actually like to punt the body, but I've never seen anybody punt the spirit. And they actually did that. They kind of, almost like a Sadducee kind of a concept, where they denied any kind of existence apart from our bodies. I think the Bible kind of forces us to deal with both of those, right? So lastly, on some of these digging deeper questions, I think it is really interesting. We've answered some of these, so I'll just kind of say them as we close. How does your understanding of being made in God's image affect your self-worth? We talked about that. I would love for you to spend some more time thinking about that. If you want a real challenge, if you love anybody, if there's anybody you can think of that you love, and maybe even somebody that even wrestles with some self-worth problems, or maybe you need to have someone come and talk to you. Say, hey, can you come and just tell me a little bit about, I'll do it with you. Just talk about my worth, because I wrestle with it. Like I don't really like the way I look, or I don't really like kind of where my life is at right now, and I just kind of need to hear some truth. I mean, what a great exercise, right? To be able to fill somebody with like something that is so much more than you're the prettiest girl in town. No, Andrea is the prettiest girl in town. Sorry, ladies. It's just a fact. Right, babe? No? Okay. Thought I'd try. So, I would recommend you do that. How does this doctrine shape your appreciation of the rest of humanity? Think about that for a moment. If everyone is made in the image of God. C.S. Lewis goes, some people get worried that C.S. Lewis goes too far. C.S. Lewis says that if we could truly see people as they were made, i.e., image bearers of God, we would be tempted to fall down and worship them. And some people go, wow, that's a little bit extreme. I get it. But do you realize what he's trying to get at? Is that how would you like just terminate? I mean, here's what's interesting, is I think this concept doesn't only affect like certain doctrines, and I'll say within like conservative Christianity, but well, I guess I'll throw myself under the bus. So I've always had a rather conservative Christian view of capital punishment. And I went as a rookie professor, first year, freshman professor at Ozark Christian College, to a maximum security prison in Jefferson City, Missouri. And I met a bunch of men that were fellow brothers in Christ in this prison. And we didn't get into a debate, but I remember kind of just thinking as I'm going in, like, wow, let's see, I wonder if my view is going to change. I wonder if my view is going to change. And it did. Now, I still actually, you may disagree with me, by the way. I still think that capital punishment may be the right thing to do sometimes. But I was forced to look at these men. One of them, his name was just Big John, and you'll never guess why. Right? But he killed these two 17-year-old boys in St. Louis when he was 20 years old, walked into a gas station, just blew their heads off. And as he was telling me the story, he'd been in jail for about like almost 30 years at the time when I met him. And he was going to spend the rest of his life, he wasn't on death row, he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison. I had to look at this man and realize, like, here is somebody who has been sentenced for, and he didn't even kid around about it, right? Yeah, I killed him. It just had a face. And this man is a genuine brother in Christ. So when I say, did my view change? It totally changed. It didn't like flip-flop. It was more complicated than that. Does that make sense? It truly was more complicated than that. And that's why I really think that this kind of conversation helps us not just with our decision, but with the process of our decision. Like, I think Christians, myself included, I speak too quickly about questions like capital punishment. By the way, I'm really okay with you getting there or even not getting there. I got good friends that are on both sides of that issue. But just tell me you dealt with image of God bearing facts of the person that you're dealing with. So when you read Genesis 9, verse 6, interestingly enough, a true capital punishment text that comes after the flood. And the Bible actually says that if someone murders someone, then they should be put to death. For the one that they killed, was made in the image of God. Now, by the way, you might go, yeah, but it's different because of the New Testament. No, I get it. I truly get it. I'm just saying, do you understand that the mandate for capital punishment actually originates from the concept that what you are taking is the life of an image bearer? See, and that's what I kind of passed over too quickly in my foolishness of youth. I just kind of jumped over it. That everyone has this value or worth. I think that's one of the reasons why, one of the things that's one of the most fascinating texts for me is that God does not delight in the death of the wicked. Think about that. So how we even talk about such things really is, it just kind of should cause us to pause when we think about taking like an image bearer of Him. By the way, the same thing is said in James chapter 3 about cursing. We cannot curse someone. And you know why James says we can't? Because they were made in the image of God. Like, do you understand who you're cursing? You're cursing an image bearer. And so if you're cursing the image bearer, you're actually making an accusation against God. That is why to literally to curse somebody or to belittle that person. If you remember when Jesus says, call no one a rakah, a fool? Do you realize how terrible that is to call someone a fool? Anyone who calls a brother rakah is actually in danger of the fires of hell. Wow, that seems kind of intense, don't you think? It's because, you don't know the worth of that person. So be very careful doing that. So these concepts are actually based back on Imago Dei principles. Also, Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 through 40, you can go and back and you can look at that. But what does the Bible say that we are to? This is the great commandment, and then the second is like the first. What is it? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Jesus adds the concept of strength. And then what? And the second is like the first, that we will love our neighbor as ourselves. And then Jesus says this, on this law, all the law hangs. Think about that. So there is this incredible connection between, Jesus doesn't just kind of list the first one. No, love the Lord your God with everything. Love your neighbor as yourself. And everything else kind of hangs on this. And when you go back and you even look at the Ten Commandments, you have 4 laws that direct our devotion and attention to God. And then you have 6 laws that direct our attention and our devotion to those people around us. That we will not take their wives, we will not steal their stuff, we will not covet their stuff, we will not bear false witness, which is to cause someone harm by the words that you say. Is kind of the biggest concept of that, not just telling a little white lie. It's actually describing bearing a false witness. And you literally have, in the Ten Commandments, love God, love everyone else. And why is that? Why is all the law about loving God and loving others? And I think it goes back to Genesis 1. How can all the law hinge around this? I think we would treat others different if we could understand that. And then 1 John chapter 4, do you guys remember that verse? If anyone says that he does not love his brother whom he sees, does not love his brother who he sees, and yet claims to love God, that person is who he does not see is a liar. So you cannot claim to love God and ignore his image bearers here on earth. There's serious ties in terms of these doctrines. Any questions as we are done 6 minutes early?
You might have one.
Go ahead, Chris.
So it was mentioned earlier, and I get the sentiment, but I kind of think it's dangerous because I've heard this twisted, but the idea that the Imago Dei equals God does not make mistakes. Because, you know what I'm
I see what you're saying. So Luke Carpenter that's not a mistake. Is that what you're kind of... I know you're not talking about that specifically, but that's kind of what you're describing.
Right, I see the Imago Dei as kind of the great equalizer, right? Everybody has this dignity that God has given them.
Mm-hmm.
But to say that they are not a mistake can be used as a justification.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, it's very interesting. It's usually used to try to justify something that is not in its perfect state, i.e. Luke Carpenter. Right? I mean, I don't think anyone should look at Luke. Now, by the way, Luke is made in the image of God. I have a sister that was born with spinal bifida. To try to go, yeah, that's not a mistake. No, it is actually a mistake. It is something that is broken. So yeah, we're not talking about that. So when we're talking about God does not make mistakes, it does not validate or exclude things that are now in what is the broken order of things. What we are saying by God does not make mistakes is that those that are made in the image of God, those that are humans, have a value and a worth, which, by the way, I will say of all humanity, no matter the degree even of their brokenness. Let me tell you one thing that I love that Ravi Zacharias helped me with. So why is it that God can kill people? Do you guys know that God does this in the Bible? So why can God do it and not us?
That's righteous.
Okay, more than that. I love that. What Ravi Zechariah says is that the giver of life, see, here's the difference. If I decide to take Beth's life, and then I go to Elias and I go, yeah, I killed your mom. Sorry. Okay, but I want you to make it up to me. I can't make it up to you. I can just say, I'm sorry. I can't make it up to you. What can God do? He can make it up. Like literally, and this is where even eternity begins to make sense. Right? So it's not even like, I don't even think it ends. Just it moves from one to the next. Right? And God does so righteously and perfectly. But one of the difference makers, it's not just that God is God and He can do what He wants. It's more than that. It's actually like God is the giver of life. Did you give life? Therefore, why do you think you can take it? So you don't have that right. And that's kind of an important piece that we need to definitely remember as we look at it. Okay? Fundamental difference between God and us. Did I see another hand? Was there another hand that was going to go up, James?
Still struggling a little bit back with the possible explanations of the image of God. And at the same time, this what you got on the board there about the flesh with the spirit soul in there. Okay? We are flesh who has been given that spirit from God. Okay? That is not, the animals don't have that. Your cat doesn't have a spirit. Okay? There's consciousness. Has, the dolphins have some of these things. Some of these ability to reason and create and whatnot. But do they have souls? I don't know how we can measure that.
Yeah. We can't. Yeah, cats don't. We don't. Yeah, we don't measure it. But what they're holding on to, what you're holding on to there is the immortality piece. Right? That's what you're describing. You're describing the immortality piece, which I think is a huge dimension of it. I think a huge dimension of it is however we understand this. Right? So I don't disagree with that. Yeah, honestly, here's if you want to know, I'll answer this question and we'll end on this note. I do not believe, okay, don't really have a lot of doctrines on this, but a little bit of what you're describing. I do not believe all dogs go to heaven, but I do believe there'll be dogs in heaven. Does that make sense? Like I do believe there'll be animals in heaven. Like I don't know if my son's dog is going to make it. Right? Like I don't know if it has a soul that translates over. I don't. I mean, by the way, if God decides to do that, I don't care. I mean, He's God. I mean, anything He does, I'm going to think is the coolest thing in the world. But there doesn't seem to be that soul connection where these things go across. But I do believe, without a shadow of a doubt, that all of the joys that we have of the created order now will exist in eternity. And by the way, I really think that everything that we've described here will actually translate over on the other side as well, i.e., dominion and creativity and work. Because all of these things that God made when He made them in Genesis 1, what did He say? They were good. And in Revelation, we actually see what? The reestablishment of the garden. And it is, behold, very good.
We're not just going to sleep on clouds all day?
No. I know I'm not. Okay. Thank you very much, guys. Can I say this? Next week, we hope you come, but it's going to be a little different. So we've actually changed it up for our great guest who's going to be coming next week. Uri, I always want to call him Ori. Uri Goldflam is going to be coming and speaking to us. We're inviting the rest of the church too, but it's not going to be theology. So if you don't want to be here, I don't know why, but I would get that. But he's going to come and do an amazing lecture on the Bible lands and how to know the Bible lands in such a way that your Bible really comes to life. And I think it'll be a blessing next week. Continue to pray for actually my time with him. We spent some time together kind of discussing some of our questions that we're going to be asking each other on Wednesday night in our discussion. A Jew and a Christian discuss Jesus. He shot some stuff back to me, which I'm kind of glad he gave me a little bit of time to think about. I sent my stuff to him. And so we're kind of arranging that conversation. So if you could be praying for that God would give me the words to say, not to do anything more than just give my witness to what I believe who Jesus Christ is accurately according to the Scriptures. So if you could do that, that'd be great. Love you guys. God bless. And we will see you, later. Or as I say to my college friends, word to your mother, peace out. I hear word to your mother is like what you college people say to each other, right?
All the time.
Yeah.
Where do your mother?
I don't know if I've seen it.
You haven't?
I know about it, don't get me wrong. Like, I know all about it. But I don't know if I had actually seen it.
Yep, there it is. There it is.
You excited? Now, when is it?
July 20th.
Well, he is marrying an amazing young lady,
Oh, thank you.
and you are marrying an amazing young man. Like, our staff loves to kind of brag about just the both of you and how excited we are for you. So,
Thank you so much.
yeah, we thank God for all that he's doing in your lives.
We asked Ryan to do it.
Did you really? That's awesome. That is awesome.
We're so pumped.
She's saying all by myself.
By Eric Carmen? Who sang it?